Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
The biases of new media. Like in the last few sessions, we talked about models of communication and deriving from the insights that like from the insights that are to be derived from the works of Jakobson, Roman Jakobson, Ferdinand de Saussure and Stuart Hall. We learnt about the different models of communications, and especially the last model, as in the Stuart Hall model, drew our attention to the biases of media and the ideological biases of media. So, from here we are going to mount the discussion onto the issue of technology and ideology, and from here we want to go into the biases, some of the biases that the new media inherits. So, from the Stuart Hall model, what we learnt is a kind of a empowerment. It is a kind of an empowerment of the audience or the reader, who is now equipped with a certain kind of a subjectivity, which was stripped of the reader or the audience in the earlier models. So, Stuart Hall equips the audience with certain kind of subjectivity. So, as I said, like if I were to recap, so the broadcaster isn't the broadcaster is perhaps deciding the content, but the broadcaster is not solely responsible about how a news content as a text would be read. So, it's a great deal dependent on people who are reading it, the audience, the reader. So, news content, as you know, for this especially for this news content on the new media is today largely customized. Like the kind of news that I see on my mobile phone is different from the news feed that appears on your phone. The kind of news feed that appears on your Facebook feed is different from that appears on my Facebook feed is different from what appears on your feed. So, as I am trying to point, like news feed, news content is largely today is largely customized. So, broadcaster decides the content of the media. So, the broadcaster like broadcasts the news, but then it does not solely decide what kind of news is going to show up in one's Facebook feed, in one's mobile phone or other electronic gadgets. So, in continuation to the Stuart Hall model, I think I would like to remind this is however not to suggest that today's media does not exercise control, exercise monopoly. I have been reiterating that the Stuart Hall model equips the reader with subjectivity, it empowers the reader. But one has to remember in this context that does not however mean, that does not however imply that today's media does not exercise control or monopoly. So, we would take the Stuart Hall model as a theoretical apparatus that helps us to understand how news or any media in media content, media as a text can be read. So, in the broader perspective, Stuart Hall model is a modular approach, is an analytical framework to understand media, but one cannot derive infer from the Stuart Hall model that now that the audience is equipped, there is no media control, there is no media monopoly such. Algorithmed news content is one very good example of exercising the gatekeeping attitude, and it is probably a makeover. It's kind of a retrieval of the kind of gatekeeping attitude that the broadcaster would exercise for the traditional media. We will come to this in a while, but let me flag post this before we get into. We are trying to get, will in the next session we will try to get into the Marxist base superstructure model, and from there we will mount our discussion onto the biases of the new media. But before we get into that, I want to like flag post here, and I want to signpost here right at the onset that like from the Stuart Hall model, one cannot infer that there is no monopolistic exercise of power in the context of today's media. Before we get into the bias of the new media, let us begin this discussion with another model proposed by Noam Chomsky and Harman. So, this is a manufacturing consent model. This also is the title of the book, which is co-authored by Chomsky and Harman, and they discuss the broadcasting corporations in the context of US and the monopolistic control of power and hegemony in the context of the US. So, Chomsky and Harman in their book show how certain media houses and broadcasting corporations like exercise their control and power over both news generation, broadcast, and so on and so forth, and they give us like 5 examples. Like these are particularly not relevant here. I am not going into the details, but for you to have a rough idea of, they talk about like ownership is like if you, as I mentioned at the onset of the last session, like if you own more media houses, the more you own, the more you are likely to exercise, the more you are in a position to exercise control and monopoly. Like the more media houses, the more technological infrastructure you own that goes into generating news, more you are likely to, more you are in a position to exercise control. So, ownership is one criteria or one prerequisite that enables the broadcaster to exercise more control and power. Like in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s in the US, like anti-communism, for example, was one very dominant trope that overwhelmed the media and the media industry and the broadcasting corporations. So, like there are 5 such features of the broadcasting corporations in the context of US that Chomsky and Harman furnish. Like they talk about these 5 features, and they demonstrate that look, this is how media houses propagate certain ideological bias. I mean the example that Chomsky and Harman give, like anti-communism. Anti-communism is a kind of an ideological disposition. So, if you recall the context of the Cold War in this context, like the Cold War between US and Russia, which involved a host of other nations, like during the Cold War, like during the Cold War, most like media houses would propagate this ideological bias about anti-communism. So, this is one ideological bias that overwhelmed the media industry in the 1970s in US. So, this is one way by which the media houses or the broadcasting corporations would exercise their control first, of course, but then also it was kind of a disposition with which they approached the reader or the client or the audience. So, they were generating through the content of the media, through the production that they made, through the news, they were kind of propagating also. It was not just the news content. So, this is what I am trying to highlight here, is it is not just the content of the news that matters, it is also about a certain ideology that was being propagated through through the news content. And I think I gave this one example right at the beginning of the lecture. Like I started this course with saying, like when the Doordarshan used to broadcast news in Hindi, there was a very popular saying, like people who were critical of the nexus between the Hindi as a language, Hindi language, and imagination of Indian nationalism, so to say. So, in sum, this idea of linguistic nationalism, like Hindi has got a certain territorial imagination of the nation, and it is kind of a dominant discourse to exercise Hindi over the non-Hindi speaking regions of India. So, when this Hindi news was very dominant in Doordarshan, there was a popular saying that it is not about like the news was being shown in Hindi, news was being broadcasted in Hindi, it was also Hindi as a vehicle for ideological, Hindi as a vehicle of a certain ideology, Hindi as a vehicle of linguistic nationalism, that was also being broadcast. So, it is not just about the content, it is not just about news in Hindi as opposed to English, Bengali, Tamil, and so on and so forth. So, the choice, the selection of Hindi as a language also functions as a kind of a ideological vehicle for a certain linguistic imagination of the nation. Yes. So, here like the example that I gave you is a certain kind of linguistic disposition. Of course, this is an example of a certain kind of ideological sensibility, which is informed by ideas and ethos of linguistic nationalism. So, the reason that I brought this up is to highlight the fact that this is how like media is like embedded. There are codes of ideology which are embedded in the media content. We were talking about manufacturing consent. So, yeah. So, in connection to Chomsky and Harman's model of manufacturing consent, and if we now try to connect with this with my example of Hindi news in Doordarshan. So, the Hindi news in Doordarshan was trying to manufacture a consent, it was trying to manufacture a certain kind of consciousness that has got to do with Hindi as a language. So, this is an example of how media houses and broadcasting corporations manufacture consent. So, it urges, it kind of urges the readers and the audience to give into a certain kind of ideological disposition, which is inherent in the media content. So, the model of the manufacturing consent is important, and the reason that I invoked it in the context of discussing biases of new media is because as I go on in the later course of this discussion, what I am trying to demonstrate, what I am trying to think, what I am trying to push you to think through is the fact that how new media also manufactures consent, how new media also propagates and generates a kind of a ideological disposition that we as recipients of new media often have to give in. So, this is one thing, I will keep this idea afloat before I go into the discussion. So, this is one thing, manufacturing consent, and the other thing is media convergence. As I said, like Chomsky and Harman give us like 5 examples, one is ownership, one is censorship, one is anti-communism, and so on and so forth. So, like these 2 things, like I give you this example of linguistic nationalism, and the like in the context of manufacturing consent, I also wanted to point to one other feature, which is I would not say characteristic of new media, but I mean this is characteristic of any infrastructure, any technological infrastructure and the new media I am going to demonstrate in the course of the lecture is no different. So, this feature apart from manufacturing consent, like the other point that I wanted to discuss is media convergence. Media convergence could mean two things. On the one hand, media convergence could refer to the digital convergence of different forms of media, different platforms of media which are now converged into the digital platform. For example, we read the newspaper now online, we browse news through Facebook online, we watch TV over the internet, we have smart televisions, we have Android TVs and so on and so forth. And we can even like nowadays with like mobile phone apps and all, as I said, like news content is largely algorithm. So, it is customized news content that feed into our personal electronic devices. So, this is one aspect of media convergence, like you have media content over different platforms which are now converged into one platform, which is to say the digital platform, like everything is digitized, everything is digital nowadays. So, that is one form of convergence. However, media convergence could also refer to a kind of an economic integration and economic convergence, in the sense as I said, like people who own more media houses are better equipped to generate or generate the kind of ideological bias. Like they have the means of production, they own a large section of the technological infrastructure. Like if they own the majority of if they own a majority of the news houses, broadcasting corporations, they can show, they can generate the content as they wish. So, media convergence could also refer to some kind of an economic convergence, where certain media houses, certain broadcasting corporations tend to own and buy more and more shares from other platforms or other media houses. Like say for example, most media houses would now have their own LinkedIn profile, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, apart from news and print circulation. So, what I am trying to suggest here is so economic convergence is not just about owning a large number of technological infrastructures, it has also got to do with vertical and horizontal integration. For example, when you are wanting to generate, when you are wanting to broadcast a news, it is your news team who you sent out there in the field. So, they get the news, it is your news house, it is your edit desk. So, you have the vertical integration, in other words, the content that you generate, you also manufacture the content. So, news could also be recycled. For example, there are news pieces which are relied on secondary sources, for example, the Reuters or the PTI. So, there is a credible news source that one trusts upon, and they derive the information or the news content from a secondary resource. So, that is one way of circulation, one way of broadcasting. So, the vertical integration is when you own the different platforms and the different prerequisites that are necessary to manufacture the news. So, you own everything. So, it is your team, it is your edit desk, it is your staff, it is your content. So, you own everything, that is the vertical line of integration. And then you have the horizontal integration, which is to say that you own like a Facebook page, an YouTube page, you circulate your news through print medium like the newspaper, or you circulate it through you stream it online, or you have like TV news content circulation. So, this is examples of horizontal integration. So, both comprised point to the kind of like the media convergence that I am referring to, which was a very dominant model in the 19th century. I will give you examples in a short while. So, I will point at like the 19th century model of media convergence has probably acquired a new currency, it has acquired a new significance as also being retrieved in the context of new media. So, I will keep these two ideas like manufacturing consent and media convergence afloat for a while. I am not getting into more details at this stage, but I will ask you, I will request you to keep these ideas alive in the back of your mind, so that like when we get into the next section, which is the biases of the new media. So, these are the two biases that I am going to discuss, like how new media manufacture consent, how new media reorients our ideological coordinates to think about issues in the way that they want us to think. The media houses want us to think about things in the way that they think. So, that is what Chomsky and Herman is calling manufacturing consent. So, they manufacture our consent regarding issues, social issues, what the news content address, number 1, and number 2, convergence, how the new media converge both like economically and like platform wise, as in multiple platform content is now digitized, and also economy wise in the sense that there is a concentration of wealth on certain broadcasting corporations, like it is a few corporations who own most of the media houses in the world. So, this is again like a 19th century model, sorry, like early 20th century model that is being retrieved by new media. So, to quickly recap, these are the two issues, manufacturing consent and media convergence, which will serve as a cornerstone for our discussion for the next session. So, in the session biases of the new media, our discussion is going to revolve around these two concepts, manufacturing consent and media convergence.